Let me tell you something, the world does not say often enough or loudly enough. The timeline you were given is not the only timeline. It is not the correct timeline. It is not even a timeline that has any basis in the actual psychology of human development. It is a social construction, built for convenience, calibrated for the average, and enforced with a consistency that has convinced generations of people that if they have not achieved certain things by certain ages, they are behind. Failing, running out of time. The psychology research says something entirely different. It says that human development does not follow a single curve, that the capacities most associated with meaningful achievement, wisdom, emotional intelligence, the specific kind of integrated thinking that produces genuinely important work, do not peak early. They develop late. In some people, very late, and that the person who was not ready at 22 or 30 or 40 is not a person who failed to develop. They are a person whose development is following a different and in many ways more sophisticated trajectory than the culture they are living in knows how to value. That is what this is about. The first thing to understand about late bloomers is what the research actually means when it identifies them. A late bloomer is not simply a person who achieved success later than average. That framing is too narrow and too focused on external achievement as the measure of development. The psychological definition is more interesting and more important. Rich Karlgaard, whose work on late bloomers is one of the most research-grounded popular treatments of this subject, identifies late bloomers as individuals whose particular combination of capacities, values, and cognitive style is not well matched to the environments and timelines that early achievement typically rewards. They are not slow, they are differently paced, and more importantly, they are differently oriented toward depth over speed, toward meaning over efficiency, toward the kind of integrated understanding that takes longer to develop than the environments rewarding early achievement have patience for. The research on cognitive development across the lifespan, particularly the work of developmental psychologist Gisela Labouvie-Vieff on post-formal thinking, is directly relevant here. Labouvie-Vieff's research found that the most sophisticated forms of human cognition, what she called post-formal reasoning, the capacity to hold contradiction, to integrate multiple frameworks, to think about thinking itself, do not develop fully in early adulthood. They continue developing well into middle age and beyond. The systems that identify and reward talent early are measuring the wrong thing for late bloomers. They are measuring the early developing capacities, processing speed, rule following, performance within established frameworks, and missing the later developing ones entirely. Here is the finding that I think is most important and most personally significant for anyone who has spent years feeling behind. The research on crystallized intelligence, the accumulated knowledge, the pattern recognition built from experience, the specific wisdom that comes from having processed a great deal of life, documents one of the most hopeful findings in the entire developmental psychology literature. While fluid intelligence, the raw processing speed and novel problem-solving capacity that peaks in the mid-20s, does decline with age, crystallized intelligence continues to develop across the lifespan, reaching its peak not in young adulthood, but in the 50s and 60s for most people, and in some individuals continuing to develop beyond that. Raymond Cattell's foundational work on this distinction, and the decades of subsequent research extending and refining it, documents something that the culture of early achievement is almost entirely structured to ignore. The most cognitively sophisticated version of most people arrives late, not early. This means that the late bloomer who is still developing their direction, their voice, their integrated sense of what they have to contribute at 35 or 45 or 55 is not behind some developmental schedule they have failed to meet. They are on the schedule that crystallized intelligence follows, the one that peaks when the world has already decided most people should have figured everything out. Let me talk about the specific psychological characteristics that the research consistently associates with late bloomers, because this is where the portrait becomes recognizable. The research on late developing high achievers and the biographical and psychological literature on individuals who produce their most important work later in life identifies a consistent constellation of characteristics that are not deficits. They are the specific qualities that make late development both more difficult and more ultimately powerful than early achievement. The first is what researchers call depth of processing, the same characteristic we discussed in the deep thinker and the highly sensitive person scripts, the tendency to extract more from experience, to not move on until the understanding is genuine rather than sufficient, to require real comprehension rather than functional comprehension before proceeding. This is not compatible with the pace that early achievement demands. The environments that identify and reward early talent, schools, early career structures, the social expectation of visible progress at regular intervals, are optimized for throughput, for demonstrable competence at regular checkpoints, for the kind of performance that can be assessed quickly and compared against peers. The deep processor cannot be assessed that way. Their understanding is developing at a level that standard checkpoints do not reach. And the result, for years, sometimes decades, is the experience of being underestimated, of knowing something is developing without being able to demonstrate it in the forms that the environment is measuring. The second characteristic is an unusually strong relationship with authenticity. Research on identity development, James Marcia's extension of Erikson's foundational work on identity formation, identifies a specific process called identity exploration, the period during which a person actively examines the values, beliefs, and commitments that will define who they are and what they are for. Most social pressure is oriented toward foreclosing this process early, toward committing to a direction, a career, an identity, before the exploration is genuinely complete. The culture rewards the person who decides early and pursues that decision consistently. It is suspicious of the person who takes longer, who keeps exploring, who refuses to commit to a direction that does not feel genuinely theirs. The late bloomer is often a person in whom the identity exploration process runs longer and more thoroughly than the social environment has patience for, not because they are indecisive, because they have a stronger than average requirement for genuine authenticity in the commitments they make, a lower tolerance for the foreclosed identity, for the career chosen because it was available and appropriate rather than because it was genuinely theirs. This is psychologically demanding. It means years of apparent drift that is actually deep navigation, of visible uncertainty that is actually rigorous internal exploration, of looking behind while moving forward because the forward direction has not yet been genuinely found. And when it is found, the research on individuals who underwent extended identity exploration before committing, the commitment tends to be more durable, more generative, and more fully integrated than the commitments made earlier under social pressure. Because it was genuinely chosen, not defaulted into. Here is something the research on late bloomers raises that connects to a much broader finding about human development, the role of failure and its relationship to eventual achievement. Carol Dweck's growth mindset research is relevant here, but the specific application to late bloomers goes beyond the general framework. The research on what is sometimes called optimal frustration in developmental psychology, the finding that development is not maximized by continuous success, but by the specific experience of encountering difficulty at the edge of current capability, is directly applicable. The late bloomer has almost always accumulated significant failure before their development reaches the stage where their capacities and the right environment finally converge. Not the failure of inadequacy, the failure of mismatch, of someone whose particular combination of capacities has not yet found the context where those capacities are the right ones for the problem at hand. That accumulation of failure, navigated, processed, learned from rather than destroyed by, produces something that early achievement does not. A specific kind of resilience and self-knowledge that the person who succeeded early and consistently almost never develops, because they never had to. The research on what distinguishes late bloomers who eventually realize their potential from those who do not is not primarily about talent or intelligence or even the specifics of their capacities. It is about their relationship with the failure that precedes their flowering, whether they carry it as evidence of inadequacy or as information about the conditions that have not yet been right. Let me talk about the neuroscience of late development, because this is the piece that gives the psychological picture its most solid foundation. Research on brain development, particularly the longitudinal neuroimaging work tracking prefrontal cortex development across the lifespan, finds that the brain region most associated with the capacities that produce meaningful adult achievement continues developing well beyond the early 20s. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for executive function, for the integration of emotion and cognition, for the long-range planning and the impulse regulation, and the sophisticated decision-making that genuinely important work requires, is not fully developed in most people until the mid to late 20s. In some individuals, the research finds continued development into the early 30s. But the more important finding for understanding late bloomers is not about prefrontal development specifically. It is about the process the research calls neural integration, the development of connections between different brain regions that allows the sophisticated cross-domain thinking that produces genuine insight. The research by Rex Jung and colleagues on the neuroscience of creativity and intelligence found that the most creative cognition is associated not with raw processing speed in any single region, but with the integration of activity across multiple regions, including regions that do not typically communicate directly in less creative brains. That integration takes time to develop. It is built through experience, through the accumulation of knowledge across domains, through the kind of sustained engagement with complex problems that produces not just answers, but the deeper understanding of the structure of problems themselves. The late bloomer whose brain is still building those integrative connections at 35 or 45 is not behind the developmental schedule. They are on the schedule that integrated, cross-domain cognition follows, which is not the same schedule as the one the culture uses to decide who has made it and who has not. Here is the piece that I find most important for anyone sitting inside a late bloomer timeline right now. The research on what the psychologist Anders Ericsson called deliberate practice, and the broader literature on expert performance and its development, contains a finding that directly challenges the early achievement culture's central assumption. The assumption is that the person who achieves early has a head start that compounds across time, that the early developer is always ahead of the late developer because they have been accumulating expertise longer. The research does not support this as a general account. What Ericsson's work found, and what the subsequent research on expert development has confirmed, is that the quality of engagement with experience matters more than the duration, that the person who is genuinely present to their experience, extracting the maximum understanding from it, processing it at depth, integrating it with existing knowledge, develops expertise faster and more durably than the person who accumulates experience without that depth of engagement. The late bloomer who has been processing their experience at the depth that their cognitive style demands, who has been building the integrated understanding that their particular combination of capacities requires, has not been losing time. They have been doing a different kind of preparation, one that the early achievement culture cannot measure because it is happening below the surface of visible achievement. And when the conditions are finally right, when the environment, the problem, and the person finally converge, the preparation that was invisible becomes suddenly, often dramatically, visible. Here is where I want to land. The psychology of the late bloomer is not a consolation narrative. It is not the good news version of what is really a developmental deficit. It is a genuine and research-supported description of a specific developmental trajectory that the culture has systematically undervalued because it does not produce evidence of itself in the forms and at the times that the culture knows how to recognize. The depth of processing that makes early achievement difficult is the same depth that makes late achievement durable. The identity exploration that looks like drift is the same process that produces genuine commitment when it finally lands. The neural integration that takes longer to build is the same integration that produces the cross-domain thinking that genuinely important work requires. The failure accumulation that precedes the flowering is the same experience that produces the resilience and self-knowledge that early success does not generate. The late bloomer is not someone who failed to develop on the standard timeline. They are someone whose development is following a trajectory that the standard timeline cannot accommodate and has never been designed to measure. And the culture that told you that you were behind was measuring the wrong things, at the wrong time, with the wrong instruments. For someone built the way you are built, the timeline was never wrong. It was always yours.